have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from Sunday, July 5th issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This article is written by Maureen Dowd. The first versus the worst. I found myself gazing at George Washington's teeth the other day. They weren't wooden, as lore has it. On a trip to Mount Vernon, which I had somehow never visited as an adult, even though my hometown is named after him, I learned that his spring-loaded dentures were fashioned from human, horse, and cow teeth. Washington was always nervous that his teeth would fly out of his mouth. Those chompers kept him in constant pain. But the father of the country was uncomplaining, unlike the crybaby of the country we now have. I just can't imagine two human beings who are more dissimilar than George Washington and Donald Trump. Ron Chernow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of our first president, told me, on the occasion of the 250th birthday party for America, that Trump has hijacked. Washington was discreet, reserved, courteous. He avoided any kind of show or ostentation or self-promotion. Chernow said with Donald Trump, it's nonstop bragging and boasting and self-promotion that would have been, I think, completely alien to George Washington. It's illuminating to look back at the life of the man who refused to be king, now that we have who fancies himself a king. Talking about the cauldron of heat this weekend, Trump boasted about his Independence Day speech in the mall. I'm going to make a real long speech just to show that I can do anything. Washington was beloved by many for giving away power he could have kept. Trump is reviled by many for snatching power he hasn't entitled to. One was methodical and judicious, hoping to consult with the Senate, more than the Senate even wanted him to. The other is driven by whims, co-opting legislative powers on tariffs and war. Washington actively avoided, as president, interference in congressional races. Trump meddles in primaries to exact revenge against fealty. One was modest, reflected the refined but decidedly unflashy surroundings of Mount Vernon. The other is a megalomaniac, reflecting in the blinding gold accoutrements festooned around the West Wing and his immoderate ballroom, which would eclipse the White House that meant to provide a contrast with the extravagant palaces of Europe. One famously wouldn't tell a lie. The other famously can't stop telling lies. Just about the only thing they have in common is that Washington's myth involved him chopping down a cherry tree, and Trump may want to do the same with some of our historic cherry trees, as he usurps East Potomac Park to install a ritzy golf course. Chernow reflected on Trump's astonishing grifting in office. In the first year of his second term, Trump collected $1.4 billion from his crypto ventures. Overall, his first year in office netted him at least $2.2 billion. George Washington was a man of such unimpeachable integrity, there was not the faintest hint of scandal during his presidency, and he was always very reluctant to accept any kind of gift because he was afraid people might interpret it as a bribe, he said. Trump is a connoisseur of quid pro quo. He took his first flight Wednesday in Qatari Force Air One with a full library and massage chairs. He plans on keeping the plane when he goes, if he ever goes. Our founders did worry a lot about the future emergence of a demagogue, Chernow said. Now their fear was that used to be called in the 18th century the man on horseback, the idea that after a bloody revolution, the victorious gentleman would parlay the victory into power and become a dictator. Washington loved his horses, but he wanted to be a farmer, not a monarch. The American people were willing to entrust him with great power because he didn't seem to be grasping for power, Chernow said. He was doing things out of a sense of duty and service, and if anything, felt burdened by the powers he assumed. Chernow blames Americans for neglecting to learn about the miracle that Washington and other founders conjured, a miracle that is now in jeopardy. You can't imagine to begin to them that the system the founders created is being trampled on, or if they don't have the rudimentary sense of what the whole design was supposed to be, he said. Mount Vernon's Garden of Memory is the cool young historian Lindsay Chernisky, who was the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. She gave me a tour when I got to see Washington's notes on his Senate's visit. Chervinsky has been trying to stay positive on the occasion of the nation's semi-quincentennial. When people ask me what Washington would think today, my first reaction is that there's a lot he would be disappointed by, and there's a lot that he would find very recognizable, even if not ideal. But I think the dominant feeling would be one of joy that the nation is still here, because most republics just don't last that long, and he knew that. The next article is written by Nicholas Kristof. Learning from Nordic Happiness. Do you know how to get an American company to grant you excellent wages and amazing benefits even for an entry-level job? Move to Norway and take the job there. Construction workers, hotel maids, service station and store cashiers will typically earn more than $20 an hour plus evening or weekend bonuses, about 5 weeks paid vacation, a pension, maternity, paternity leave that adds up to a year, and paid leave when a child is sick. You may even get paid time off if you move homes. Those are broadly the terms for Norwegian and foreign companies alike, including the likes of 7-Eleven shops, Burger King restaurants, and ExxonMobil affiliated service stations, which raises the question, if American and other international firms can offer such munificent terms for the retail jobs in Norway, could they do so in our country? We'll get to that, but what unfolds here is a result of the Nordic social economic model, which aims to reduce inequality, both opportunity, and optimize the quality of life, providing a lift in particular for those at the lower end of the income scale. What we tend to think of as low-wage jobs aren't truly low-earning in Norway, and they came with state-provided health care and child care, plus strong unions that ensure that layoff or firings are rare. You want security, health care, and the American dream? Look to Scandinavia. We actually live in the American dream, Jens Stoltenberg, a former Prime Minister of Norway, who was the finance minister, told me. The American dream, it's more reality in the Nordic countries than in America. Skeptics have argued that generous welfare benefits and the resulting high taxes have held back the Nordic economies, perhaps a bit. Farewell, Nordic model, The Economist wrote in 2006. But Norway is now richer than the United States per capita, and Norwegian workers are more productive than American workers. With higher output per hour, Scandinavians live longer than Americans. They are happier. The 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, all rank among the 6 happiest countries in the World Happiness Report based on Gallup polling. Yet, the Nordic countries themselves face significant challenges, including fiscal pressures, immigration, widening inequality, and perhaps some breakdown in the social consensus. Some doubts whether the model can survive here, let alone be exported to countries that are larger, less homogeneous, and more suspicious of taxation. On the other hand, it's not an alien model, but for Americans, a path we once blazed. Lawrence Katz, a Harvard economist, told me that the U.S. and Scandinavian nations pursued similar policies from the 40s through the 60s. That was the period when the United States rapidly expanded educational opportunities, experimented with universal child care. The post-World War II period is sometimes thought as the golden age, for the economic pie both grew and was sliced more equally. The United States in the mid-20th century was sort of like Scandinavia today, Katz says, but America's changed course in the 70s and eventually embraced the Reagan Revolution. One reason for the retreat, I've argued, was racialized political rhetoric that characterized some safety net programs and investments in opportunity used by Americans from all walks of life, as handsome primarily benefiting black people, with a particular emphasis on characters of the welfare queen. It is also true that American economy in the 70s was underperforming market and did need a kick in the pants in the form of deregulation. The Nordic countries largely continued their investments in human capital and reducing inequality. Although I've been visiting the Nordic countries for decades, I became more interested in their model over the past 15 years. Because of struggles at my hometown in rural Oregon, mills and factories closed, meth arrived, and 3 school friends died while homeless on the streets. I can't help thinking that they might be alive today if they've been born in Scandinavia with its strong social safety net. How does this system work in practice? Consider Hauk Kejoran, 24, a waiter at Nectar Restaurant in Oslo. He has been in his job for only a few months, but is paid more than $25 an hour, not including tips. He also gets 5 weeks vacation, earns a pension, is entitled to a hefty parental sick leave, and is studying to be a sommelier, all paid for. A full work week in Norway is 37 and a half hours, but Kejoran asked for a 60% contract. I have some other stuff to do, and I like my freedom as well, he explained. One waitress at the restaurant's on leave, sailing around the world with friends. I asked the restaurant owner, Vasilimi Hevsen, what she thought of her missing employee. She wanted to do this, Hudson said. So we say yes, why not? It's how we build the whole country, she added, taking care of each other. When Americans discuss the Nordic system, they sometimes suffer from 3 misunderstandings. The first is that these are socialist countries, when they are often run by social democracies. They have market economies. Sweden did experiment in the 70s and 80s with the quasi-socialistic policies, but upshot was an economic crisis. As Johan Norberg, a Swedish writer, put it, we have been socialist and we've been successful, but never at the same time. The second misunderstanding is that because of the strong welfare system, citizens of Nordic countries lie around while collecting benefits. Sure, some people do manipulate the system, but the labor force particularly rate is higher in Nordic countries than the U.S. The third is that in the case of Norway, its success is mostly a reflection of its oil wealth. Oil has given Norway a nice cushion, but the country has also managed the cushion unusually well, putting it was one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. Moreover, according to Geir Aleksen, the Director General of Statistics, Norway, the increase in female labor force participation in Norway since the early 70s appears to have added roughly as much to the country's gross domestic product as oil has. Indeed, women are unappreciated component of the Nordic economic engine. Historically, American women had higher rates of labor force participation than women in most countries, but Scandinavia now easily surpasses the United States by this metric. In 2025, some 56% of American working age women were in the workforce. In Sweden and Norway, the figure was around 62. In Iceland, 70%. Having the flexibility to work part-time or adjust hours is one factor that almost certainly increases the share of women in the labor force. Another factor is the availability of high-quality daycare. Norway's system, which is typical, takes children from age of 1, and the cost is about $120 a month. For low-income families, it's nearly free. If it wasn't for the kindergarten, we wouldn't have 3 kids, says Merkel, a social engineer, as he dropped by the daycare center in Oslo, where his middle child spends the day. He had his 10-month-old daughter on his arm. She'll start in August. The day center where I met Breck was in a working-class Oslo neighborhood, with bright rooms and a diverse group of children playing with one another, all rattling away in Norwegian. That's one aim of the system, encouraging children in immigrant communities to embrace being Norwegian from an early age. 1/5 of Norwegians are either immigrants or their children, often from countries like Syria or Somalia, with conservative social cultures. Daycare centers try to nurture Nordic social attitudes, which tend to be more liberal. In June, we were taking about Pride Month, and Catherine Peterson, the chief of the daycare center, which had a rainbow flag fluttering outside. To understand how the Nordic socioeconomic system evolved, I dropped by the office of Kelly Mann, an economist at the University of Oslo. The system began in the 30s, he said, when workers in thriving sectors of the economy agreed to hold down their wage demands to support sectors that were struggling. That principle, sacrifice help those not doing so well, still underpins the region business model. Norwegians who are better off will give up some income to ensure that people in blue-collar jobs get by. Main argues that the wage compression promotes innovation and dynamism by boosting the profitability of growth industries. The lowest wages become higher, destroying the bad jobs. The highest wages become lower, creating more good jobs. In addition, the social safety net in Nordic countries means that workers are less fearful of trade and technology costing their jobs. It makes it easier to embrace policies that boost growth overall. I wonder if wage compression may also result in a political compression. Seems to be less political toxicity in Nordic countries than in the U.S. and many other countries. By international standards, civility reigns. Right-wing nationalists exist here, but haven't made as many inroads as in Germany, France, or Britain. Eric Lausalberg, the governing mayor of Oslo, is an important figure in the country's Conservative Party. He opposes the country's wealth tax and generally thinks Norwegian taxes are too high, but by American standards, he would come as liberal. I strongly believe that what we do in the Nordics to provide opportunity for all is growth promoting. In the United States, I would probably be on the left. For all the success of the Nordic model to date, it is under great pressure. Many social benefits are expensive, and paying for them is a growing challenge as the population ages and requires more elder care. Every institution of the society is under strain, says Shazia Majid, columnist at VG, a Norwegian newspaper. She noted that because so many women are working, they're probably able to care for aging parents. They aren't able to care for aging parents. At home labor, that would probably fall to women more often than men. And the system is financially oppressive as it needs tens of thousands of more health workers. Immigration adds to their challenge, particularly in Sweden, where a quarter of the population is now made up of immigrants or their children. Let me read that back. In Sweden, a quarter, it means 25% of the inhabitants are immigrants. Serious observers, mostly notable Mario Draghi, the former European Central Bank president and former prime minister, suggest that Europe has lost some of its competitiveness and that the sentiment resonates in the Nordics. As well, I think there's something to that, but the hand-wringing can be overdone in the case of the Nordic countries. Sweden ranks number 2 in the Global Innovation Index, produced by the World Property, ahead of the United States at number 3. Finland and Denmark are also in the top 10. I've been talking about Nordic policies, but what if the big driver of success isn't policy so much as norms? These are traditional, homogeneous societies that maintain village values of mutual support. When researchers lost wallets in 40 countries around the world, 2 countries with the highest rates of wallet return when they contain money were Denmark and Sweden. That's editorial comment. That's quite interesting. My sense is that norms and policies reinforce each other. Solenberg offered me an example of policy molding norms. In the 1980s, he and others pushed for paid paternity leave and part of the culture that dates would spend time with their newborn children. This social engineering worked. Fathers now are deeply involved in caring for children, taking some of the load off moms. That's perhaps one of the reforms that have really changed Norway, Stoltenberg told me. Is a Nordic model replicable, rather? Could convenience stores and service stations in America pay their cashiers and attendants $20 or more an hour, plus a pension and 5 weeks vacation? One challenging economist told me is relative to many American workers, Norwegian laborers often have higher literacy rates, appear more able to pass a drug test, can handle technology better, and can be relied upon to stay in their jobs longer, meaning that employers benefit from a more experienced, more productive workforce. In effect, Nordic employers can pay more in part because workers generate more income. In that sense, learning from the Nordics is not as simple as raising minimum wage and seeing happiness soar. Rather, it's the challenge of investing in human capital from early childhood through university-level education, pushing relentless to broaden economic opportunity at every level. All this raises taxes, but also raises skills and make workers more productive. From a distance, we see how much Nordic workers get. Up close, you can see how much they contribute. And then wrote a comment after listening to this article about the Scandinavian countries. Do you still consider the United States the best country in which to live? Mm-hmm. Pathetic groveling is no way to rebuild the party. The Democrats' constant pleas for cash don't exactly exude confidence. This is written by Michelle Cote. Not infrequently, I open my email to find a fundraising request from the Democratic Party with a subject line that reads as though it was sent by a contrite boyfriend. Can I explain? You deserve an explanation. Sorry to reach you on a Sunday. Let me try to convince you, please. Can I level set with you, Michelle? Okay, that one sounds more like a dippy business consultant trying to wow me with vapid jargon. But my point is that right up front, these messages telegraph insecurity, pleading, chagrin, hardly the vibe of a confident political team fighting the good fight. My overriding impulse is not to give the party campaign cash, but to offer to pay for group therapy. The Trump years have been hard on Democrats' psyches. Every time the party leaders see the president mulling off on the job or read one of the late-night truth bombs, they must agonize anew. How the heck did we get thrown over for that guy? But enough with the public hand-wringing and self-flagellation, especially when it comes to asking people for money. Fundraising requests are plenty annoying even when they aren't pitiable. The blue team tends to claw back some self-respect and reassure voters that they aren't being asked to back a bunch of losers. Better still, maybe it's time to rethink these toxic and tiresome pleas altogether. Across the political divide, Republican solicitations are their own kind of nightmare. The full urgency and scaremongering along endemic to political fundraising have been, surprise, turbocharged in the Trump era. American Carnage for Eva. Each week I receive between a dozen and 1,000 over-the-top warnings from the GOP and its allies that boil down to give us $20 right now, or Barack, Hillary, and AOC will send their baby-eating terrorist coddling, devil-worshipping millions to your house to imprison your family and turn your dog into a communist. The hysteria often comes with a fat dollop of Trumpian imperiousness, not requesting your engagement so much as demanding it. Verify your GOP party affiliation immediately, instructed a message from Kellyanne Conway. Or how about this one from Donald Trump Jr.? Have it back to us by 11:59 p.m. He instructed a voter questionnaire, which naturally included a box to check indicating how much money I'd be sending. And MAGA being Magna, the risk of being cast out of the fellowship hovers over everything. I have lost count of how many times I have been informed MAGA membership, cancel, termination, pending, final warning, complete and total termination. For me, these read more than promises than threats, but mostly they come across as pure bunk. Pro tip, no political organization will ever terminate your opportunity to give it money, I promise. You can be a neglectful or abusive significant other, and they will always come crawling back for more. In fact, between scolding and batches or GOP messages, I'll sometimes get a conciliatory note reassuring me that I am still a valued part of the inner circle, assuming I send money, of course. One point in the Republicans' favor scratch away the toxic layers of fear and hysteria in their solicitations And if you squint hard enough, you can sometimes catch a glimmer of something constructive. Many of the messages are peddling a sense of pride and belonging, primal impulses at the heart of the MAGA movement. They put heavy emphasis on the value of maintaining one's place in the fellowship, and by extension, the sadness of failing to patriot, you're America. 250 shirt won't equal in time if you wait. A note from the National Republican Senatorial Committee recently cautioned. A core problem, maybe the core problem with Trumpism in general, is that it relies on divisiveness and hate to foster their sense of community. This only makes it more crucial for Democrats to hawk a strong, confident, appealing counteroffer, suited to the party ethos, of course. The blue tea can't skip the patriot palaver. Its voters don't roll that way. Likewise, bullying commands are unlikely to resonate in a party not trained to follow a strong man. But making people feel part of something larger than themselves is always a good bet. Remember the hope-charging energy of Barack Obama's first presidential run? For all his retrospective corniness, the campaign made people feel great about themselves and the leader they were supporting. The Democrats should be focused on making voters proud to support their team again. I get that mass money grubbing is a dark art. Consultants test every element of how to get people. Often people pay only sporadic attention to politics. To open a message and then open their wallets, tone, timing, background color, everything gets analyzed. During President Obama's 2012 run, his fundraising gurus noticed a bump in donations at moments when the candidate stumbled, for instance, a bad debate performance. So they streamlined the donating process to facilitate what came to be known as drunk donating. Fundraising solicitations are what they are because they generally work. They're well enough with some fractional recipients. At least in the short term. The longer view is another story of deluding people with fake urgency and full intimacy, risk making them feel misled, disrespected, sour about the whole political process. It erodes trust and energy, and I'm telling it burns people out, said Lee Smith, a Democratic communication guru. In the long term, it's not healthy for any political party to indulge in these sorts of tactics. Focusing on building relationships and a sense of shared values takes more work than creating quick hits optimized to elicit drunk donations. But considering the larger public's tragically low opinion of and trust in the Democratic Party, the entire political system really, Democrats need to shake things up. Maybe start by promoting an emotion other than exhaustion, and a more inspiring message than you have no other options. With political parties as with boyfriends, few people are excited to invest in an insecure loser. This article is written by Jamel Bowie. 5 words that changed America. There is a moment for every American when the first encounters of the Declaration of Independence. For most, it comes to her as Scripture, the highest and most sacred text in the nation's civic religion, encapsulated by the moving assertion of human equality. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration is a profound statement of values, a universal aspiration for human freedom. As President Gerald Ford said in his speech marking the nation's bicentennial, the Declaration is the Polaris of our political order, the fixed star of freedom. It is impervious to change because it states moral truths that are eternal. As a matter of civic faith, this is what the Declaration means. As a matter of history, the story is much more complicated. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, was less an affirmation of human equality than a pointed claim about the nature of political authority and powerful assertion of the right of revolution. Informed by the Enlightenment writer of John Locke and other social contract theorists, it was meant as an argument about the preconditions of government, an assertion of the purity of pre-lapsian life, not a roadmap for emancipation. The opening assertion of self-evident truths concerned men in a state of nature before government was established, the historian Pauline Maier observed in American Scripture. Making the Declaration of Independence with regard to persons, equality meant simply that no one held authority over others but the right of birth or as a gift of God. In other words, Jefferson was channeling a common sentiment in revolutionary America, a political orthodoxy whose basic principle colonists could pick up from sermons or newspapers, even school books, without reading his systematic work of political theory. Maier wrote, just look to Thomas Paine, who wrote in Common Sense, published about 6 months before the signing of the Declaration, that all men being originally equal, no one by birth could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever. Jefferson's equality was a thought experiment. It did not extend to political society, nor was it meant for those placed beyond the political community. Men could be created equal and still be different. Men could be created equal and still be subordinate. This, for many patriots leaders, was a given. But then there was outside the circle of belonging, women, natives, landless laborers, and most starkly, black Americans, both free and enslaved. They did not read, or most likely hear, the Declaration as an abstract claim about pre-lapsian past. I'm sorry, that's a new word for me. I'll spell it. Prelapsarian. Prelapsarian. I'll have to look the word up because I don't know what it means. They understand it as a radical statement of principle for the present, and they wield this principle against society that will not extend the revolutionary promise of freedom and self-government to those held in bondage. It was their declaration, the one they made for themselves, that stood for a universal claim of human equality in the here and now. And it was their declaration that would come to supplant Jefferson's historical metaphysical one as the linchpin of America's civic ideal, passing from black Americans to abolitionists to the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln, who consecrated their declaration at Gettysburg as a spiritual foundation for a new birth of freedom and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, established 77 years ago in 1776. It is a declaration that is under assault from a political movement that rejects the credo vision of American Republic in favor of an exclusionary racial nationalism that defines American citizens by blood and heritage, that sneers at the 5 words about equality, in the Declaration that worships at the altar of hierarchy and caste, but is also the Declaration that still inspires Americans to fight for their place in this country and demand their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is hard to exaggerate the alacrity with which black Americans seized on the rhetoric of the Revolution to demand a free and equal place in the new and nascent American Republic. We would therefore humbly pray that while you are consulting, asserting, and maintaining your own natural rights against the arbitrary design of those who would subjugate slavery, that you would think on our unhappy case, who have long been groaning under the unsupportable burden. Bert Lambert, an enslaved man bound in Connecticut, wrote on the Sons of Liberty, Connecticut, on behalf of the number of poor Africans. We do not know much about Lambie, but his petition, which was issued in October 1774, is written in the idiom of the Revolution, using the same terms that Jefferson would employ just 2 years later. Your petitioners apprehend that liberty, being founded on the law of nature, is necessary to the happiness of an African, it is to the happiness of an Englishman. Lambie wrote that there was notwithstanding but present state of slavery have in common with other men a natural right to be free and without molestation, and enjoy such property as by our honest industry may acquire. Your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom, which the greatest parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatsoever, but they were unjustly dragged by the cruel hand of power from their dearest friends, and some of them even torn from the embraces of their tender parents, reads the 1977 petition, a great number of Negroes who were detained in a state of slavery. It is signed by Prince Hall, a leading member of Boston's black community, Lancaster Hill, Pitty Bees, and Brister Slenzer, among others not listed. They cannot but express their astonishment, the petitioner continues, that it has never been considered that every principle for which America has acted in the course of all unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of your petitioners. The use of the language of the Declaration and the Revolution was not merely rhetorical. The point of this petition was to push the legislators to treat the opening words of the Constitution laws as more than preambulatory, to treat them as pregnant with real meaning and live consequence. In 1779, petition to the New Hampshire legislature from Narrow Brewster, an enslaved man in the late 60s, and 19 other announced that freedom is an inherent right of the human species, and beseeches the legislature to graciously interpose in our behalf and enact such laws and regulations as your wisdom think proper, whereby may regain our liberty and be ranked in the class of free agents, and that the name enslaved may be not more be heard, and that the name of slave may not more be heard in a land gloriously contending for the sweets of freedom. To read the words of black Americans free and enslaved is to see the Declaration in motion, to see it as a living document with meaning far beyond the circumstances of American independence, and it is to see the fact that this meaning was made, constructed by people with an intimate, fundamental sense of what freedom meant and what it required. As a form, the petition called on its authors to show some humility. Other formats follow more poignant than fiery rhetoric, blasting patriot leaders for their hypocrisy. Attend to your own declaration, reads a 1983 editorial in the Maryland Gazette by the anonymous Vox Africanorum. These truths are self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life and liberty, pursuit of happiness. We shall offer no arguments. Nay, it would be insulting to the understanding of America at this enlightened period to suppose she stood in need of argument to prove our right to liberty. It would be to suppose, Vox continued, that she has already forgot those exalted principles that she lately asserted with her blood. Perhaps the most famous example of a funding Arab black American wielding the words of the Declaration be fulfilled comes from Benjamin Banneker, the naturalist and mathematician, who quoted Jefferson's words back to him in 1791 letter confronting the Secretary of State on his hypocrisy. You publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine which is worthy to be recorded and remembered in all succeeding ages, he wrote. We hold these truths to be self that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Having hailed the Declaration as eternal truth, Banneker then holds up in negative contrast to its author. How pitiable to reflect that although you were fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind and of his equal and impartial distribution of these rights and privileges which he had conferred upon them, you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part, my brethren, under groaning captivity and cruel opposition, that you should at the same time be found guilty of the most criminal act which you professedly distrusted in others with respect to yourselves. Jefferson, then serving under George Washington, had never understood himself as making a statement about political and social equality, but black Americans absolutely did, and as we see, they did not hesitate to pressure the former American revolutionaries with their own words and commitments. Many of them felt the contradiction in ways that put lie to the mind on error that men of their time were innocent of moral fault, or that is the distortion or corruption of history to tell the truth about their hypocrisy. And in the present, you should see the assault on black history and black studies by conservative reactionaries as an attempt to obscure the fact that black Americans of the early republic were men of their time as well. One consequence of this pressure was that by the first decade of the 19th century, most northern states had either abolished slavery or put it on a path to extinction. Even in the South, there was a burst of energy related to manumission. Virginia amended its law of 1782, make it easier for owners to free their slaves. And several men, including John Payne and Dolly Madison's father, did just that. Emancipatory energy was short-lived. Technology development like the cotton gin and the burgeoning Industrial Revolution in England would make enslaved Africans newly valuable, a lucrative asset that drove the production of vital commodities. It was during this time that the Declaration faded from mainstream view as an object of veneration, to be supplanted by the Constitution in American political discourse, except that is among black Americans and their allies who continue to wield it as a binding promise of freedom and equality against slavery, slaveholders, and government that serve their interests. George Byrne, an English-born Presbyterian minister in Virginia, published the book on slavery, Irreconcilable, in 1816, where he condemned politicians who held Declaration of Independence in one hand and the lash in the other. An editorial comment, when we read about this time period, religions, all religions, whether they be Protestant or Catholic, and I'm not sure about the Jewish religion, but they were all hypocritical because they're preaching goodness, etc., etc., and, and yet their congregations weren't so good. In his inaugural 1831 issue of the Liberatory, his anti-slavery newspaper, William Lord Garrison, quoted the Declaration extensively in his appeal on behalf of the slave. While our Declaration of Independence boldly proclaims the self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights. At the very center, governmental human beings are born almost daily, when the law is pronounced to be from the birth not equal to other men, and who are for life deprived of liberty in the pursuit of happiness. Garrison, it should be said, hated the Constitution and condemned it as a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, because of the ways it empowered and strengthened the grip of the slave-owning South on the national government. But the Declaration was a torch that lit the path to salvation. The South Carolina abolitionist Angelina Grimke declared slavery contrary to the Declaration of Independence in her 1836 appeal for Christian women of the South and in stark condemnation of American hypocrisy. The covered Anti-Slavery Society of New York proclaimed in 1831 that in our opinion that the blood of the colored brethren should be the people of the United States, since the Declaration of Independence was kept as a reservoir. The framers of that institution and their successors might swim in it. Frederick Douglass made what was the most famous condemnation of the United States 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." Throughout, he wields both the language and the ideals of the Declaration like a scalpel, whether we turn to the Declaration of the past or the professions of the present. The conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. Douglass said to be the hundreds of people packed in Corinthian Hall in Rochester to hear him speak. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other day of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. It was in the hands of the abolitionists, black and white, carried over from black America, freed and enslaved, that the Declaration worked as both an indictment and a promise, the spiritual foundation of the nation and the standards that institutions. And in this vision of the Declaration, Abraham Lincoln hailed it as ascended to political leadership in the 50s, fending off Southern slaveholders and their apologists. Provoked by men such as Senators John Calhoun of South Carolina and Stephen Douglas of Illinois, back in the political combat at the start of the decade, by the eve of the election as president, Lincoln was hailing the Declaration's claim of equality as a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. It was an axiomatic truth, he contended in 1859, written into a merely revolutionary document that was applicable to all men in all times. And as the first time in his Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That Lincoln enshrines this understanding, shaped by the demands of enslaved people, decades before his birth, into America's national identity. It is in this vision of the Declaration that was written in the Constitution as the 14th Amendment, whose most consequential section guarantees the equal citizenship of all people born in the United States, a promise the Supreme Court just affirmed against the President's attempt to win birthright citizenship by executive fiat. Let it be born in the mind that this is the government of men representing every people and kindred and tongue under the whole heavens, the Representative John Bingham of Ohio, key architect of the amendment, in an 1869 speech defending his work about a year after its ratification, and that the inception of our national struggle for representative government in 1776, the Declaration of the People was not that all white men are created equal, but that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with the rights of life and liberty. As we mark this year the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, it is important to see that its meaning is dynamic, and that meaning, as we understand it, flows less from the men who signed it than those who heard its words and took ownership of them as a standard for their freedom and independence, not from Britain, but from bondage. It is this declaration, the slaves' declaration, the abolitionist declaration, Lincoln's declaration, that is the beating heart of the American project. It is this declaration that still lives as a promise to the people who call this nation home, as a challenge to those people to live up to their ideals and aspiration, and as a bulwark against those among men who would sacrifice their freedom or their false comfort of tyranny. It is this declaration that shows us the way we might be truly exceptional. Editorial comment. The writers of the New York Times are without peer. They certainly bring their message to the forefront. So, you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, July 5th issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability